Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this postmortem of my Blitz game number 801. My opponent started off with e4 and I went with e6, the French defense. You know, the French defense I think is quite a good opening for the club player. It's not seen as often at the top levels, although it's still quite a playable opening, and there are some grandmasters that still play it. Mostly, someone explained it this way, that it lacks a niche for the grandmaster. The grandmaster, if he wants a draw, will play with e5 and go for a Berlin defense or a Marshall. And if he wants to play for some kind of fighting game with black, then he will go for the Sicilian. So the French, it can be a fighting game. It can be a game where you're playing for a draw, but somehow it is always the second choice to one of those other two openings at the very top level. And also there's a lot of theory that the grandmaster has to memorize, so it lacks a niche. But for the club player, because it's not played as often, your opponents sometimes don't know what to do as well, and I think it leads to a lot of interesting play. Okay, so anyway, that's the French defense. He goes with knight f3, and that's a rare move. d4 is the main choice, but actually I've seen this, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about this. I just continue with d5. If you play c5, you've actually transposed into an e6 Sicilian, so that's a legitimate way to play. But I go with d5, and then he went with e5, which basically is going to transpose into some other kind of French defense. To stay in unique lines, the knight c3 move needs to be played here. And this is where I got into trouble. It's actually easy to go wrong here. If you play with c5 here, which is a pretty natural move if you play the French defense, I've made that mistake before. The center becomes very weak, and black has this check that can sort of disrupt the defense of the center there. So that's not good. And if you play with taking, it just kind of opens things up, and white is doing pretty well in those lines. So the best move here is knight f6, and I'm repeating this because I've failed to play this move a couple of times. There's someone at the club who plays this way, and I always forget about this knight f6 move, so I definitely wanted to continue. And then the main move here is to push on. Knight goes back, d4, c5, and it starts to look like a normal French defense. Maybe I would have brought this knight out to e7 rather than d7, but this is quite a playable position as well. So anyway, that's the way to play it. And if he takes, instead of pushing, just take back with the pawn, and then this turns into something like the exchange variation of French defense, which is also very solid for black. So that is fine as well. Anyway, in the game, he didn't play knight c3. He pushed on with e5. So this is the game, and now c5 is okay. And he goes c3, building up to the center, knight c6. And now watch, after he plays d4, suddenly we have a large number of games in the database. See, at this point, it's kind of an obscure sideline. And after knight c6 and d4, we're back into the main line of the French advanced variation. The two moves here are bishop d7 or queen b6. I usually play with queen b6. A lot of times both moves happen anyway. And then, well, the interesting line here is bishop d3, followed by bishop to d7. Bishop d3 doesn't really leave the pawn hanging because there's a check, a discovered attack on the king. So bishop d7 blocks that check. And sometimes white even sacrifices a pawn and plays a gambit there. The other way to play this is with a3. And then the main move here is knight h6, which really seems strange to me. I think when I played this before, I took. But it looks like if I'm not going to play knight h6, then I should play with c4 or bishop to d7. Looks like those are the main ideas here. I guess c4 makes sense now that white has set up this structure with all his pawns on the dark squares. You can push and have some sort of light squared control. Anyway, that's just for my reference too. I go queen b6, and I don't see that move a3 so often, so I don't have much of an idea how to play against it. He goes bishop e7, and I go knight. He goes bishop e2, and I go knight to e7. I was thinking afterwards maybe I should have taken that pawn first before bringing the knight out, but it turns out this is okay for black as well, so nothing really has gone wrong until this move. This move is the move that takes us out of the opening book, and so it's interesting when your opponent plays a move like this. You should always take a second to see if there's something wrong with it, and in fact it's not a good move here, and I found exactly the right way to refute it, which is kind of nice. I exchanged here first, and then I played h5. And if you can get one of these moves in, this is deflecting the pawn. It's worth a pawn sacrifice often to take care of that annoying pawn and open up some lines here. And when he takes, he's got these doubled h pawns, which are not worth a whole lot, particularly at this point in the game. Maybe in the end game they might be worth something, but throughout the middle part of the game they're going to be weak and they're not controlling any useful squares. If you think about it, a pawn on the edge here is only half as powerful as a pawn anywhere else on the board, because other pawns control 2 squares. Sorry, 2 squares. Most pawns control 2 squares, but the pawns on the rook files only control 1 square, so they're only half as strong in a way. And the squares they control are not very influential in most cases as well. So anyway, look for these deflecting moves. A nice point here is that he can't support it with h3. It's a move he'd like to play, but then I'll just take, and there's a pin on that rook. So that was why this move is so effective. And if he pushes on, this also has the same effect of giving up the f5 square for my knight. So he took, which he might as well do. And I play knight f5. So this wins the d pawn. I wasn't sure if he could defend it during the game, but it turns out if he plays bishop e3, I'm just going to take here, and so there's really no way to defend that pawn. The chess engine thinks he should just develop with knight to c3. Pretty logical. He chose a3, but it turns out whatever he plays at this point is going to be a pawn down. So let's see, I take with the c knight because I wanted to keep control of this square with the other knight, but that wasn't really necessary. Once again, if he tries to do anything with the bishop, I have queen takes b2 there. Anyway, he took the knight off, and I took back with the queen, and just went for this endgame position where I'm a pawn up and I have better I have just a more solid pawn structure, so he's probably going to be losing a second pawn before too long. Let's see, his next move is a mistake. His best defense here is actually bishop to d1. He played bishop to d3, which guards against this the knight c2 check, which was threatened. And let me play this nice knight f3 check. So that was a decent move, but there was actually a better move here if you want to pause the video here and see if you can find the best move for black. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. The best move for black is knight to b3, forking the rook and the bishop. And I had noticed knight b3, but I didn't notice that the bishop was unprotected. Normally this knight b3 move is met by a move like rook to a2, and it's a little bit awkward for a while, but it's not winning any material. But in this case, I can just take the bishop after the rook moves. So let's see, the chess engine gives this line: bishop to f4, knight takes rook, and knight to d2, with the idea of only giving up the exchange by controlling those escape squares for the knight. Still a winning material edge. This wins a pawn, so I'm a couple pawns up at this point, and it's also a winning move, so not a huge blunder, but it's funny that I missed that knight b3 idea, because I'd even thought about it, but I was not noticing the undefended bishop. You don't think of bishops on the back rank as being undefended, but it happens, and you should be aware of it. Okay, so he has to move the king, and I grab the pawn. Let's see, he goes bishop e2, getting away from my knight, and I just start getting my pieces out now. Knight c3, bishop to c5, starting to think about targeting this f2 pawn here. He goes b4, kicking the bishop, and a4. So I play a5 to stop those guys from rushing, and he played knight b5. And here I make what I consider the biggest mistake of the game. I didn't make too many mistakes in this game, which is kind of nice. After the last two games, I at least kept an edge in throughout this game. This is a mistake though, because I was just a little too worried. This knight is kind of an annoying piece with all of these threats, so it keeps my bishops tied down, and I just got rid of it. Also, I was a little worried about taking the pawn here and opening up the a file, but for his pawn push to harass my bishop. But it turns out those were both unfounded fears. So I should just take the this pawn here, and if he pushes on with a5, for one thing, I can just take it, and for another, it's still pinned. The rook is undefended on the back rank, so I can actually round it up that way with the knight. And anyway, that's even stronger. Let's see. The other idea is he could try and move this knight in here directly, but actually this loses the knight. The knight is not easily escaping from that location. After I go king here, the knight just has to retreat. I guess it doesn't lose the knight. No, I'm sorry, it does lose the knight. After the knight goes back, then I will take it, and I have a pin on that pawn. Yeah, so wherever the knight goes, it's lost. If he takes on b7, then bishop to c6 traps the knight, and so there's just nowhere to go. And if he tries to free it with b5, you can just take the knight, and once again this pawn is still pinned, so there's no time for him to take the bishop. So that was the best way to play, was just to grab that pawn there. And instead I trade off the knight. So it's still winning for black, but not as much. Let's see. So I brought the knight back to block. Let's see. He went bishop d2, putting more pressure, and now I finally took on b4. And yeah, I mean, things got a little awkward here. My king has few squares to go to, and my knight is pinned, but there's just no way for black to exploit it. So at this point, I just grabbed that pawn, gave up on the idea of castling, grabbed the h-pawn. He went on with a5 here, and I just moved the bishop. I didn't even have to move. That pawn is still pinned, but anyway, I moved it. Let's see, he went rook d1, harassing the bishop. And oh yeah, I left the bishop there. That's what I did, and just pushed the pawn forward. That was the idea I had when moving the bishop. I saw that I could support it with the pawn in the center of the board, and that would be a good piece there. Let's see, he went king g2. I brought my king forward here. My main idea in bringing my king forward is to support these pawns and unpin the knight. And he brought his king out, king to f3. And I wanted to mention this as a mistake. The chess engine thinks that the best defense here is to kind of sit on the position a little bit. Rook to c1, put a little more pressure on the knight. Rook to h6, defending laterally. Rook h to g1, looking to maybe get pressure on the g file. Rook to f6, coordinating with the bishop on the f pawn, and then bishop back to e1 to defend the pawn. And black is still winning, but the game will continue. This move king f3, I particularly wanted to mention it because it breaks a rule about the endgame, which is it's not safe to bring your king out until there's less than 14 points of force on the board. So, meaning pieces, not counting pawns, just pieces. So that's the rule of 14. So if you think of it, 14 points is a queen and a rook. So if I had a queen and a rook, it wouldn't be safe for that king to be wandering around. And I have two rooks and two pieces, so that's 16 points. So that's more than 14. But it's 14 or more. It's not safe. So definitely it's not safe to be bringing the king out. And the way you exploit it is by just taking advantage of the exposed king and delivering checks to it. So this is actually a bad move, and black's position goes downhill pretty quickly from here. Let's see. I just unpin the knight, and well, he takes some force off. So maybe this is okay. He's down to 13 points, but that king Yeah, somehow it feels like it's not safe coming out. Anyway, I went g6. He went h4. I went rook over to f5, taking a look at that f pawn, f3, and then rook to f4 check, driving the king back. So the king went to g3. Yeah, I think it's even more dangerous if the king comes forward. I think it could get mated with the rook coming over. So he had to go back. Let's see, and then I saw a way to go into a rook and pawn endgame where I'm a couple of pawns up, and this is a pretty easy win at that point. So I go for it. Bishop f2 check, and rook takes. And not only do I have two extra pawns, but his pawns are very weak and scattered, so should be an easy win. Let's see, he goes on with h5, just dissolving his weaknesses, which is probably the right idea, but it still leaves me with this big central mass of pawns. So and so now I'm 3 pawns up. Let's see, he goes rook to c1, and just push this pawn forward. Rook c2, c4. Yeah, just get those pawns rolling. You can't really stop them. Delivers this check, and I block. Goes rook to h8, maybe to check from behind. Push forward. Checks. And I can hide from the checks here on the f5 square. Goes rook to c8. Okay, staying on the c file. I'm sorry, no, he goes rook to c8 here. Bringing the other rook over to coordinate against my c pawn. I just push it forward. He goes rook to c6, looking at this pawn. And let's see, the quickest finish is rook to b2, force another trade right here. I wanted to force a trade without messing up my pawn, so I played rook to b5. Let's see, he went king e2, and now I force off one pair of rooks. So he went king d3, so I take it. Come in with this check. He went king back to c1, and I went over here, and he resigned at this point. Once this pawn is gone, it's pretty easy to bring the other pawn forward, so I don't have to worry about holding on to this pawn anymore. So he resigned at this point. Anyway, like I said, I had a couple of games, the last 2 games, where they were very up and down. They were interesting and exciting games for all of that, but there were games where I could have lost, whereas at least at this point I played a solid game and managed to keep my winning edge. So good that I can still do that. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you again soon. Bye.